Michael Davis turned off the ignition of his police cruiser and gazed at the house before him, his house. After 14 years on the force, countless overtime shifts, and frugal living, he had finally achieved what had once seemed impossible for a public servant's salary. Homeownership in Oakwood Estates, the most sought-after neighborhood in Riverdale County. The 3-bedroom colonial with its pristine white siding and wraparound porch wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of everything he'd worked for. The morning sunlight glinted off the windows as 2 burly movers hauled his leather couch up the front steps. His brother James, who would be renting the fully finished basement apartment, directed traffic with enthusiastic waves. "Can you believe this place, Mike? We actually pulled it off," James called out, his grin visible beneath his construction worker's tan. Michael was about to respond when he felt the distinct sensation of being watched. Across the street, a slim woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair, pulled into a severe bun, stood perfectly still, scrutinizing his property. She wore pressed khakis and a polo shirt with what appeared to be an embroidered logo. In one hand, she clutched a leather-bound clipboard. In the other, an expensive-looking smartphone. When she noticed Michael looking back, she didn't smile or wave. Instead, she made a deliberate note on her clipboard and snapped a quick photo of his driveway before turning on her heel and marching away. "Who was that?" Michael asked his next-door neighbor, a friendly retiree named Walter, who had come over with a welcome basket of homemade banana bread. Walter's jovial expression clouded. "That, my friend, is Elaine Winters, HOA compliance officer, self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, and the reason 3 families moved out last year." He lowered his voice. "We call her the clipboard commando behind her back, but most folks just say Karen, and everyone knows exactly who they mean." Michael laughed it off. After dealing with armed suspects and high-speed chases, how bad could one neighborhood busybody be? He was about to find out. The first friendly reminder appeared in Michael's mailbox only 3 days after move-in. Printed on expensive cream stationery with the Oakwood Estates emblem embossed at the top, it detailed the proper placement of garbage and recycling bins, stored in garage, only visible between 6 p.m. the night before and 6 p.m. the day of collection. At the bottom was a flowing signature, Elaine Winters, HOA compliance officer, followed by her phone number, email, and the HOA website, where he could review the complete covenant at his earliest convenience. By the end of his first week, Michael had received 3 more notices, one about the proper height of lawn grass, 3.5 inches maximum, another regarding approved exterior paint colors. His house was thankfully already compliant, and a third about overnight parking regulations that gave him pause. All resident vehicles must be garaged overnight when practicable. Driveway parking is permitted only for guest vehicles and shall not exceed 48 consecutive hours. Michael frowned at this. His single-car garage barely fit his personal sedan. His police cruiser, which department policy required he keep readily accessible for emergency call-ins, would have to stay in the driveway, and James's pickup truck, necessary for his construction business, was too tall for the garage even if they could squeeze it in beside Michael's car. That evening, while James grilled steaks on the back patio, Michael mentioned the parking rule to Walter, who had stopped by with a 6-pack to welcome them properly. "Oh, that rule." Walter rolled his eyes dramatically and took a long pull from his beer. "It's selectively enforced, like most of Elaine's little power trips. The Richardsons across the cul-de-sac have 3 cars in their driveway every night, but they're on the HOA board with Elaine, so—" He made a dismissive gesture. "But the Paddles 2 doors down got fined $200 last month because their college-age son came home for spring break and parked his beater in the driveway for a week." "That doesn't sound legal," Michael said, his brow furrowing. "Welcome to HOA living, buddy." Walter clinked bottles with him. "It's all there in the covenant you signed at closing. Most people don't read the fine print until it's too late. But surely reasonable exceptions." Walter cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Reasonable and Elaine Winters don't belong in the same sentence. When my wife died last year, I put a small memorial garden gnome by our front steps. It was her favorite. 2 days later, I had a violation notice for unauthorized lawn ornaments. When I explained the situation, Elaine said, and I quote, "Rules don't take vacations for sentimentality." Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. In his years as a cop, he'd seen how a small amount of power could transform ordinary people into petty tyrants. It seemed Oakwood Estates had a textbook case patrolling its manicured streets. For 2 weeks, Michael managed to avoid direct contact with Elaine despite the increasing frequency of notices appearing on his door. He worked rotating shifts at the precinct and rarely saw his neighbors during normal hours. James, who left for construction sites before dawn and often returned after dark, had already received his own collection of warnings about his truck's presence in the driveway. The inevitable confrontation occurred on a rare Thursday evening when both brothers were home simultaneously. Michael had just started the charcoal in their new grill, and James had brought out a cooler of cold drinks to combat the unseasonable heat. Michael's police cruiser and James's mud-spattered pickup sat side by side in the driveway. The doorbell rang with an insistent, repeated pressure that suggested it was not a social call. "I'll get it," Michael sighed, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Through the frosted glass of the front door, he could make out a rigid silhouette. He opened the door to find Elaine Winters standing on his welcome mat, clipboard clutched to her chest like armor, her thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. "Mr. Davis," she began without preamble or pleasantry, "I've left several notices regarding the parking violations occurring at this property." She gestured toward the driveway with a manicured hand. "As you've chosen to ignore them, I'm here to inform you personally that you have 24 hours to comply with the overnight parking regulations before the HOA begins assessing fines. The initial penalty is $100 per day, escalating to $250 after the first week." Michael maintained the calm demeanor that had served him well during countless tense situations on the job. "Good evening, Ms. Winters. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Michael Davis." He extended his hand, which she pointedly ignored. "I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Davis. Your compliance, not your acquaintance, is my concern." Michael nodded slowly. "I understand there are rules, Ms. Winters. However, there are practical considerations here. My brother's truck won't fit in the garage. Then perhaps your brother should consider alternative transportation or alternative housing." She cut in coldly. Michael felt a flash of anger but suppressed it. "Additionally, I'm a police officer. That patrol car needs to remain accessible for emergency calls. It's department policy." Something flickered across Elaine's face, a brief, malicious satisfaction. "The covenant makes no exceptions for profession. Rules apply equally to everyone in Oakwood Estates." "Actually," Michael countered, "the rule states vehicles must be garage when practicable, given the circumstances. I've been enforcement officer for 9 years, Mr. Davis. I think I know the regulations better than someone who's lived here less than a month." She thrust a thick booklet at him, a copy of the HOA covenant. "Page 47, Section 8, Paragraph 3. I've highlighted the relevant passage. 24 hours, Mr. Davis. I don't make exceptions." Before he could respond, she turned and marched down his front path, her sensible shoes crunching on the perfectly regulation height grass. James appeared in the doorway behind him. "Who was that? You look like you just ate something that disagreed with you." "That," Michael said grimly, "was our first direct encounter with the HOA Karen. Bad? Let's just say I've interrogated murder suspects who were more reasonable." Michael spent 3 hours that night poring over the HOA covenant, all 136 pages of it. The parking regulation was indeed on page 47, exactly as Elaine had indicated. However, the full text revealed interesting nuances. All resident vehicles must be garaged overnight when practicable. Exceptions may be granted by the board for oversized vehicles or special circumstances upon written request. Driveway parking is permitted only for guest vehicles and shall not exceed 48 consecutive hours without prior approval. The phrase "exceptions may be granted" gave Michael hope. At 11:43 p.m., he drafted a detailed email to the HOA board explaining both his and James's situations. He attached documentation, his department vehicle policy and measurements showing the physical impossibility of fitting James's truck in the garage. His tone was respectful, professional, and solution-oriented. He even offered compromises. James could park on the street during the day, and Michael would ensure both vehicles were always well-maintained and never blocked the sidewalk. Email sent. He went to bed feeling confident that reasonable people would see reason. His optimism was short-lived. At 6:17 a.m., as he prepared for his morning shift, his phone pinged with an email notification. The response wasn't from the full board as he'd hoped, but solely from Elaine Winters. "Mr. Davis, your request for special parking consideration has been reviewed and denied. While we appreciate your service as a law enforcement officer, the covenant is clear regarding overnight parking. Exception requests must be submitted on Form HOA 7B, available on our website, with a $75 processing fee, and are typically reviewed at the quarterly board meeting. The next meeting is scheduled for August 17. In the interim, you remain subject to full compliance with all Oakwood Estates regulations. The 24-hour notice period stands. Regards, Elaine Winters, OA Compliance Officer." Michael stared at his phone in disbelief. August 17 was more than 2 months away, and why had Elaine responded instead of the board president? Something didn't add up. He texted Walter, "Quick question. Who reviews exception requests for the HOA? Is it the whole board or just the compliance officer?" Walter's response came a few minutes later. "Full board votes on all exceptions." Why? Michael's suspicions deepened. He forwarded his email exchange to Walter, who responded with an angry face emoji followed by, "She's intercepting board communications again. Bill Thompson, HOA president, warned her about this last year. Want me to forward to him?" "Please do," Michael replied. He glanced at his watch. Time to leave for work. The parking issue would have to wait until his shift ended. He climbed into his patrol car, noticing Elaine watching from her front window across the street. She made no attempt to hide her surveillance, even raising her coffee mug and a mock toast when their eyes met. As he pulled away, Michael couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. 14 years of police work had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to escalate from annoyance to genuine problem. His instincts were rarely wrong. Michael's Friday shift was busy. A fender bender on Main Street, shoplifting at the mall, and a domestic disturbance that thankfully resolved peacefully. By 7 p.m., he was patrolling the Eastern District and looking forward to his weekend off. His radio crackled. "Unit 417 dispatch." "Go ahead, dispatch," Michael responded automatically. "We have a complaint about illegal parking at 1435 Oakwood Drive. Caller states she's the HOA compliance officer and that vehicles are parked illegally in violation of neighborhood covenants. She's requesting immediate police response for towing and citation." Michael nearly swerved off the road. 1435 Oakwood Drive was his address. Elaine Winters had actually called 911 over a perceived HOA violation, a civil matter that had no business involving emergency services. "Dispatch, can you confirm the nature of this call? This sounds like a civil matter, not a police emergency." The dispatcher's voice held a note of exasperation. Caller was quite insistent, said it was a blatant violation of legally binding covenants, and that the vehicle owners were hostile and threatening when approached about the violation. Michael's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Hostile and threatening. He hadn't even spoken to Elaine since their brief interaction at his door yesterday, and James had been at a job site all day. "Dispatch, advise the caller that civil covenant violations are not police matters unless there's a breach of peace or safety concern." "Already did, sir." She insisted we send an officer and cited Municipal Code 47.3 regarding illegal parking on private property. Michael almost laughed. As a 14-year veteran, he knew the Municipal Code by heart. What Elaine was attempting was a gross misapplication of a law meant to address abandoned vehicles or parking that blocked emergency access. A plan formed in Michael's mind. "This is Unit 417. Tell the caller I'll respond personally to assess the situation. ETA 20 minutes. Copy that. Unit 417. Michael made a deliberate U-turn. He'd handled countless difficult people in his career. Armed suspects, belligerent drunks, combative Aristides, but something about Elaine Winters' pettiness, her deliberate misuse of emergency services for a personal vendetta, ignited a slow-burning anger he rarely allowed himself to feel. As he drove toward Oakwood Estates, he called his sergeant. "Hey, Sarge, it's Davis. Just got a call about illegal parking at my own address." He explained the situation briefly. "I'm responding personally. Wanted to give you a heads up in case this goes sideways." His sergeant's laugh rumbled through the speaker. "The HOA dragon called the cops on a cop." "Oh, this I wish I could see. Handle it however you see fit, Davis, and maybe record it for the next department barbecue." 20 minutes later, Michael pulled his patrol car into his own driveway beside James's truck. Elaine Winters stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. That smile faltered as he stepped out of the vehicle in full uniform. For a moment, genuine confusion crossed her face. Then came the dawning realization, followed swiftly by something Michael recognized from countless perp walks, the look of someone who suddenly understands they've made a terrible mistake. "Good evening, ma'am," Michael said, his voice carrying the professional neutrality he perfected over years of difficult encounters. "I'm Officer Davis. I understand you reported illegal parking at this address." Elaine's mouth opened and closed soundlessly before she gathered herself. Yes. These vehicles," she gestured stiffly to the driveway where his patrol car now sat beside James's truck, "are in violation of our neighborhood covenant, which clearly states—" "Ma'am," Michael interrupted gently, "are you aware that misuse of emergency services is a punishable offense in this county?" Her eyes widened. "I didn't. This isn't." Calling 911 for non-emergency situations diverts resources from genuine emergencies and can result in fines up to $500 for the first offense. He removed his notebook from his breast pocket and began writing. Additionally, making false statements to a police officer, such as claiming residents were hostile and threatening, when no such interaction occurred today, falls under Section 31.5 of the County Code. The color drained from Elaine's face. "I merely wanted to report. HOA covenant violations are civil matters, Ms. Winters, not criminal ones. The proper channel for addressing such concerns is through your association's established procedures." Michael glanced up from his notebook. "Now, I'll need to see some identification, please." "Identification, but I haven't." "Standard procedure when taking a report, ma'am." Elaine fumbled in her pocket and produced her driver's license with trembling fingers. Michael noticed several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. As he copied her information, Walter approached, phone in hand. "Officer Davis, I've got Bill Thompson, HOA president, on the line. He'd like to speak with you." Michael nodded. "Thank you, sir." He took the phone, maintaining eye contact with Elaine as he spoke. "Mr. Thompson." "Yes, this is Officer Davis. I'm currently responding to a 911 call placed by Ms. Winters regarding alleged covenant violations at my residence." He listened for a moment. "Yes, that's correct. My residence." Another pause. "No, sir. HOA matters are not police matters unless they involve threats, violence, or safety concerns." He glanced pointedly at Elaine. "Yes, I'd be happy to attend an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. works for me." He handed the phone back to Walter, whose barely suppressed grin suggested he was thoroughly enjoying this turn of events. "Ms. Winters," Michael continued, "I'm issuing you a warning today regarding misuse of emergency services." He tore the citation from his notebook and handed it to her. "This is not a fine, merely documentation of our interaction. However, any future misuse will result in financial penalties." Elaine stared at the paper in her hand as if it might bite her. "Additionally," Michael continued, "I've been invited to tomorrow's emergency HOA board meeting to discuss this incident and the broader issue of covenant enforcement in Oakwood Estates. I'd strongly encourage you to attend." The whispers from the gathered neighbors grew louder. Someone in the back of the small crowd actually applauded. "Now, is there anything else I can help you with this evening, Ms. Winters?" For the first time since he met her, Elaine Winters seemed at a loss for words. Without responding, she turned and walked stiffly back to her house, the warning citation crumpled in her white-knuckled grip. As the impromptu audience dispersed, Walter clapped Michael on the shoulder. 14 years I've lived here, he said, voice thick with emotion, and I've never seen anything so satisfying in my life. Michael allowed himself a small smile. Just doing my job, sir. Just doing my job. By 9:45 the next morning, the Oakwood Estates Community Center parking lot was filled beyond capacity. Residents who'd never attended an HOA meeting in years had shown up, drawn by texts and phone calls that rapidly spread the news of the previous evening's confrontation. Michael arrived in civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, but the way the crowd parted for him as he approached the entrance made him feel as though he were still in uniform. People he'd never met smiled and nodded respectfully. An elderly woman actually patted his arm and whispered, "Thank you, young man." Inside, the meeting room was standing room only. At the front, a long table seated the 5 HOA board members, with Elaine conspicuously absent from her usual seat at the end. Board President Bill Thompson, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, called the meeting to order precisely at 10 a.m. Before we address the incident that prompted this emergency session, I want to make something clear, Thompson began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the packed room. The Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association exists to maintain our community's standards and property values. It is not, and has never been, intended as a vehicle for harassment, intimidation, or selective enforcement. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. I'd like to invite Officer Michael Davis to share his account of yesterday's events. Michael approached the microphone and succinctly described the situation, from the initial parking notices to the 911 call. He kept his tone professional and factual, avoiding editorializing. "Thank you, Officer Davis," Thompson said when he finished. "Now, I understand Ms. Winters is not in attendance today despite being specifically invited. However, we have received this from her." He held up a sealed envelope, a letter of resignation from her position as compliance officer, effective immediately. The room erupted in spontaneous applause. Thompson waited for it to subside before continuing. "While this addresses the immediate issue, the board recognizes that we have a systemic problem. For too long, we've allowed enforcement to become punitive rather than constructive. Today, we open the floor to community feedback about how we can better serve all residents." What followed was 2 hours of catharsis as neighbor after neighbor approached the microphone with stories of Elaine's overzealous enforcement. A young mother who'd been fined for a children's chalk drawing on her own driveway. An elderly man cited for excessive bird feeding when his arthritis prevented him from immediately cleaning spilled seed from his patio. A family who received daily notices when their roof shingles were damaged in a storm, despite having already scheduled repairs. The Paddles, who confirmed Walter's story about their son's car, adding that Elaine had threatened to place a lion on their home over the accumulated fines. As the testimonies continued, board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. When the last speaker finished, Thompson cleared his throat. "On behalf of the board, I want to apologize. We failed in our oversight responsibilities. Starting today, that changes." He outlined a series of immediate reforms. All outstanding fines would be reviewed and potentially forgiven. The compliance role would be restructured into a 3-person committee with rotating membership. An appeals process would be established for all citations. New rules would require photographic evidence and board approval for all fines over $50. Monthly open forums would be held for residents to voice concerns. As the meeting adjourned, Thompson approached Michael. "We have an opening on the board now," he said quietly. "Someone with your experience in conflict resolution and community relations would be an asset. Would you consider running in the special election next month?" Michael was surprised by the offer. "I'll think about it," he promised, though uncertain if he wanted to dive deeper into HOA politics. As he walked to his car afterward, Michael was stopped by at least a dozen neighbors introducing themselves and expressing gratitude. Walter accompanied him, providing running commentary on who was who in the community. "You know," Walter said as they reached Michael's driveway, in all the excitement, "I forgot to ask, did you actually give Elaine a real citation yesterday?" Michael smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say she received exactly what the situation warranted." Walter laughed. "Well, whatever you did, you've become a neighborhood hero overnight. Oakwood Estates might actually become a friendly place to live now." Michael glanced across the street at Elaine's house, where the blinds were tightly drawn. "That's all I wanted in the first place," he said quietly. "Just a good place to call home." 6 months later, Michael stood on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the early morning activity of his neighborhood with satisfaction. So much had changed since that fateful confrontation with Elaine. The for sale sign had appeared in front of her house within 2 weeks of the emergency meeting. The property sold quickly to a young family with twin toddlers and a large, friendly Bernese mountain dog that would have given Elaine daily aneurysms. Michael had helped them move in, part of the newly established Welcome Wagon Committee that now greeted all new Oakwood Estates residents. Against his initial inclination, Michael had indeed run for the open board position. The election wasn't even close. He received 87% of the votes. His first official act was to help draft the reasonable implementation guidelines that now govern how covenants were enforced. The document emphasized community standards while acknowledging the practical realities of modern living. The new 3-person compliance committee operated with transparency and common sense. Warnings replaced immediate fines. Assistance was offered instead of punishment when residents, particularly elderly or disabled homeowners, struggled to maintain their properties. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community enhancement. As board liaison to the compliance committee, Michael had introduced a Neighbor Helping Neighbor program. Monthly community service days brought residents together to help with larger projects, fence painting, landscape cleanup, minor repairs. What had begun as practical assistance evolved into social events, with barbecues and potlucks following the work sessions. The changes weren't limited to covenant enforcement. The community newsletter, once filled with stern reminders and violation statistics, now highlighted resident achievements, welcomed new neighbors, and advertised community events. The previously underutilized community center hosted game nights, movie screenings, and classes taught by residents sharing their skills. Property values hadn't suffered. In fact, they'd increased by an average of 7% since the reforms. Turns out, people were willing to pay a premium to live in a neighborhood known for its community spirit rather than its draconian rules. Michael's reverie was interrupted by James calling from the driveway, where he was loading tools into his pickup truck, still parked exactly where it had been on the day of the confrontation. "Hey, Mike, don't forget we've got the Community Center Renovation Committee meeting at 7 tonight. Michael raised his mug in acknowledgement. The renovation had been his idea, expanding the center to include a small fitness room and upgraded kitchen for community events. The project was being funded through a combination of prudent budget management. The HOA had been sitting on a substantial reserve fund and donated materials and labor, much of it coordinated by James through his construction contacts. As James drove off, Walter emerged from his house across the street, walking his new puppy, a retirement gift to himself that he claimed kept him young. The memorial garden known for his late wife now had companions. The small collection had become something of a neighborhood landmark. "Morning, Board Member Davis," Walter called with his usual good-natured teasing, ready for the neighborhood watch meeting this afternoon. The watch program had been another of Michael's initiatives, not because Oakwood Estates had crime problems, but because it created natural opportunities for neighbors to connect and look out for one another, particularly the elderly residents who lived alone. "Wouldn't miss it," Michael replied. "Sarah's bringing her famous lemon bars." "In that case, I'll definitely be there," Walter laughed. "Oh, by the way, did you hear about Elaine?" Michael raised an eyebrow. He rarely thought about the former compliance officer these days. "What about her?" "Moved into Lakeside Manor Estates. Apparently she's already at war with their HOA board over the color of her mailbox." Walter shook his head with a bemused expression. "Some people never learn." Michael chuckled. "Well, I wish them better luck than we had." As Walter continued his walk, Michael took a final moment to appreciate the view from his porch. Children waited at the corner for the school bus, parents chatted over property lines, and an elderly couple strolled hand in hand down the sidewalk. In the distance, a group of volunteers was planting flowers around the neighborhood entrance sign. This was what a community should be, not a collection of rules and violations, but people living together with mutual respect and genuine care for their shared environment. His police radio crackled from inside the house, time to get ready for his shift. As he turned to go inside, Michael noticed a new family pulling into a driveway 3 houses down. They'd moved in just last week. He made a mental note to stop by later with the welcome basket sitting on his kitchen counter. After all, good neighbors didn't just enforce rules, they built relationships. And at Woodwood Estates, every resident now understood the difference. And if somewhere across town, Elaine Winters was meticulously documenting her new neighbor's infractions, clipboard still in hand, well, that was no longer Oakwood Estates' problem. They'd moved on to something better. Sometimes, Michael reflected as he closed his front door, the most effective policing had nothing to do with badges or citations. Sometimes it was simply about helping people find better ways to live together. And that was a case he was proud to have solved.